Up until that fateful day, I'd always thought my life was exactly as it should be, predictable, well-organized, and blessed with stability. My daily routine, my marriage, and my job all fell neatly into place like clockwork. My wife, Laura, and I had settled into a comfortable rhythm over the years. Together with our 2 young sons, we lived what I believed was an enviable life, grounded in love, trust, and understanding. As we moved through the days filled with the typical highs and lows of raising kids, I took comfort in the solid foundation I thought we had built. To anyone looking in from the outside, we were a picture-perfect family. There were no cracks in our marriage, or so I thought. Standing there that cool autumn afternoon, I could never have imagined how quickly everything I believed in would come crashing down. It all started when I came home early from work, feeling unwell. I parked in the garage, feeling a bit queasy and worn out, closing the garage door to keep the chill out. I collapsed onto the living room couch, intending to rest for a few minutes before heading to bed. Moments later, I heard the front door open, followed by my wife's familiar voice and her sister, Diane. They had come in through the front, so they couldn't see me lying there on the couch, out of sight and out of mind. I thought about announcing myself, but a wave of nausea kept me still. Unintentionally, I ended up overhearing their conversation. They were talking about an upcoming trip to Chicago they'd been planning for years, a weekend filled with art exhibits and shows. It was their annual escape, a tradition where Diane's husband, Tom, and I would stay back to watch the kids while they enjoyed some well-deserved time off. I couldn't see them, but I heard the excitement in Diane's voice as she admired a new dress Laura had bought. "Wow, that's a gorgeous dress," Diane said with admiration. "Has David seen it? Does he know you're taking it on the trip?" My curiosity piqued. I listened a bit longer, half smiling at the thought of Laura buying a new dress just for this trip. But then Laura's reply came, and I felt my smile fade. "No, if he saw it, he'd get suspicious," she replied, her tone casual. "So, don't say anything, okay? Mark's going to love it." Mark? The name jolted me out of my resting state. I lay still, my nausea forgotten, as I strained to listen to the rest of their conversation, trying to process what I'd just heard. Mark was no one I'd ever heard of before, and the way she'd said his name, it set off alarms in my head. My heart pounded, my mind scrambling to make sense of what I was hearing. The questions came fast and relentless. Who was Mark? Why was Laura keeping secrets about him? As I lay there, listening to more hushed exchanges between Laura and Diane, I felt the cold grip of suspicion begin to take hold. My entire sense of security began to crumble, leaving me wondering if the life I'd thought was so perfect was, in reality, nothing but an illusion. After Laura and Diane left the house that afternoon, I sat on the couch, staring blankly at the wall, my mind reeling. The name Mark echoed in my head like a cruel taunt, each syllable chipping away at the certainty I'd once felt about my marriage. I struggled to reconcile the Laura I knew, the loyal, dedicated wife and mother, with the stranger I'd overheard making plans with someone else. I kept thinking, could it be a misunderstanding? Maybe Mark was just a friend or someone from work, someone I'd never heard about. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I couldn't ignore the way she'd said his name, or the secrecy in her tone. The dress she'd hidden, the excitement in her voice, all of it pointed to something more than just friendship. The truth, as bitter as it was becoming harder to deny. A part of me wanted to confront Laura immediately, to demand answers, to force her to explain. But another part held me back. What if I was wrong? What if this was some innocent misunderstanding? Charging in without proof could risk our family, cause damage I couldn't repair. I needed to be sure before taking any action. That night, I barely slept. Lying next to Laura, my mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. I felt like a stranger in my own bed, sharing a home with someone I suddenly didn't know at all. I wondered how long this had been going on, how long she'd been living this double life, and if I'd ever truly known the woman I'd married. The days that followed were filled with doubt and confusion. Every interaction with Laura became a test, a search for clues. I watched her more closely, noticing small details I'd once overlooked, the way she guarded her phone, the quick glances she shot my way when she thought I wasn't looking, the sudden, hushed phone calls. Each small thing became another piece of a puzzle I was terrified to complete. Yet, I couldn't bring myself to ask her about Mark. The words felt too heavy, too dangerous. If I was wrong, I'd risk shattering the trust we'd built over decades. If I was right, well, I wasn't ready to face that reality just yet. So, I kept my silence, hoping against hope that this nightmare would resolve itself, that I'd somehow wake up to find it was all in my head. But as each day passed, that hope grew dimmer, replaced by an unsettling realization, I might be on the brink of losing everything I'd worked so hard to build. And the worst part was that I had no idea how to stop it. The days passed slowly, each one filled with a gnawing sense of dread I couldn't shake. My mind kept going in circles, replaying Laura's words and wondering what they meant for our family. Eventually, I realized I couldn't face this alone. I needed advice, someone who could help me see clearly through the fog of betrayal and suspicion. That's when I decided to reach out to Jerry. Jerry was more than just my lawyer, he was one of my oldest friends. We'd known each other since college, and over the years, he'd been a steady presence, someone I could trust with anything. So, I called him up, asking if we could meet for coffee. When we sat down, he could tell something was wrong right away. "David, you look like you haven't slept in days," he said, concern clear in his eyes. I hesitated, trying to find the right words. "Jerry, I think Laura is having an affair," I admitted, the words feeling foreign on my tongue. He paused, taking in my expression before speaking. "What makes you think that?" I recounted the conversation I'd overheard, how she'd mentioned someone named Mark, the secrecy, the hidden dress. As I spoke, Jerry listened carefully, nodding now and then. When I finished, he sat back, his face a mix of sympathy and seriousness. "David, this isn't easy to hear, but you need to prepare yourself. If there's a chance she's been unfaithful, it's important you don't jump to conclusions without proof. You'll want to know the full story before making any decisions." "What should I do?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. I hated that it had come to this, that I was asking for legal advice about my own wife. "First, stay calm," he replied, his voice steady and reassuring. "Keep an eye out for any other signs, anything that confirms or contradicts your suspicions. But remember, you have rights here. You've built a life together, and if things turn out the way you fear, you'll want to make sure you're prepared for what comes next." His words were both comforting and sobering. I realized that, for the first time, I needed to consider the possibility that my marriage might not be what I thought it was. The life I'd built, the family I loved, it all felt like it was slipping through my fingers, and there was little I could do to stop it. Jerry's advice gave me a plan, something solid to hold on to in the midst of my turmoil. I thanked him, feeling a weight lifted, if only slightly. But as I walked back to my car, I couldn't ignore the growing ache in my chest. No matter how much I prepared myself, the truth was coming, and I knew that once it arrived, there would be no going back. After talking to Jerry, I felt a little steadier, but the need for answers gnawed at me constantly. I couldn't live in the dark any longer, waiting for something to slip. If Laura was hiding this from me, then I needed to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. With a heavy heart, I decided to take Jerry's advice and search for proof, hoping that what I'd find would somehow relieve my doubts, but knowing deep down that it probably wouldn't. One evening, when Laura was out, I sat down at our computer, her login details swimming in my mind. Laura wasn't one for secrecy, or at least she hadn't been until recently, so her email and social media were easy to access. My heart raced as I clicked through her inbox, feeling the weight of guilt and dread. I'd never crossed this line before, never felt the need to question her loyalty. But now, as I scanned through her messages, I knew there was no turning back. Then I saw it, a thread with the name Mark in the subject line. The latest email, sent just that morning, was short but clear. I can't wait to see you again. Last night was unforgettable. Same place next week. My stomach dropped. My eyes scanned over every word, and with each line, the reality of her betrayal hit me harder. There were emails going back months, even small details of their meetups that left nothing to the imagination. The man I'd heard her mention in passing, the man I'd been hoping was a friend or colleague, was something much more. I closed the emails, unable to read further. My mind was spinning, caught between disbelief and a cold fury that was hard to contain. Laura, the woman I had built my life with, was living another life right under my nose. Everything I thought I knew felt like a lie, and I was left wondering how long she had been pulling the strings, playing the role of wife and mother while secretly giving herself to someone else. When she came home that night, I could barely look at her. Every word she spoke felt like salt in the wound, a reminder of the lies I'd uncovered. Part of me wanted to confront her right then and there, to lay it all out and demand answers. But I knew that wasn't enough. I needed time to process, to decide how to move forward. As I lay in bed that night, pretending to be asleep while she lay just inches away, I felt like a stranger in my own life. The world I thought I knew had shifted, and all that was left was a painful emptiness, a reminder of the betrayal that would change our family forever. The day after uncovering Laura's emails, I still felt numb, as if I were moving through a haze. There was no going back to how things were, no way to unsee what I'd read. I knew that I couldn't carry this weight alone. The only person who came to mind was Tom, Laura's brother. He'd always been a good friend to me, and, in his own way, he'd been like a brother I'd never had. I knew he deserved to know, especially if what I suspected also involved his wife, Diane. I invited Tom over that evening, keeping my tone casual, even though my hands were shaking. When he arrived, I wasted no time. "Tom, there's something I need to tell you, something I found out about Laura. And it might involve Diane too." He looked at me, confused, his brow furrowing. "David, what are you talking about? Involve Diane, how?" Taking a deep breath, I recounted everything, the overheard conversation, the emails, the plans Laura and Diane had been making. I watched as his face transformed from confusion to shock, then anger. Tom shook his head, disbelief etched across his face. "Are you saying Laura is having an affair? And that Diane might be involved?" I nodded, feeling the weight of my own words. "I can't say for sure about Diane, but I have a feeling she knows more than she's letting on. And if she's been helping Laura cover this up, then it's likely she's complicit." Tom's hands clenched into fists, his face tight with frustration. I never would have believed it. "Diane and we've had our issues, sure, but I thought I could trust her." He paused, the gravity of the situation sinking in. "Do you have proof?" "I found emails," I replied, my voice low. "Between Laura and a man named Mark. There's no mistaking what they're about." For a long moment, neither of us spoke, the weight of the betrayal settling over us like a heavy fog. Tom looked down, shaking his head. "If Diane's involved in this, I need to know the truth. I need to find out how deep this goes." We sat in silence, each lost in our own thoughts, processing the reality of our broken marriages. Together, we agreed that the only way forward was to uncover everything, every secret, every lie. There was no way we could continue on without knowing the truth, no matter how painful it might be. By the time Tom left that evening, we'd formed a silent pact. We would support each other through this, work together to expose the truth, and, if necessary, confront Laura and Diane together. This betrayal ran deeper than either of us had anticipated, and the only way to face it was side by side. After talking to Tom, it became clear that this betrayal went far beyond the bounds of a typical affair. We both had to confront an uncomfortable, gut-wrenching question that neither of us could ignore: what if the children we'd raised, loved, and cared for weren't biologically ours. The idea was almost too painful to consider, but with all the lies that had come to light, anything seemed possible. A few days later, Tom called me. His voice was steady, but I could sense the turmoil underneath. "David, I've been thinking. We can't just sit here waiting for answers. We need to know if our kids, if they're really ours." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. I had already been struggling with the same thought. "I know," I replied, feeling the weight of each word. "I don't want to doubt them, Tom, but, if we're ever going to move forward, we need the truth." After a long conversation, we decided to arrange paternity tests. It was a cold, clinical step to take, but one we both felt was necessary. The tests would give us the answers we needed to face the future, whether it was with or without the stability we'd known. The process was discreet and quick, but the wait for the results felt like an eternity. Each day stretched on, filled with a tension that was almost unbearable. Around the house, I found myself looking at my children differently, not because I loved them any less, but because I now carried a nagging fear that they might not truly be mine. Every innocent question from them, every call of "Dad," tugged at my heart, reminding me of what I stood to lose. I hated myself for doubting, but the betrayal had planted a seed of suspicion that was impossible to ignore. Tom and I kept each other updated, checking in every day as the test results grew closer. We had promised to be there for each other, no matter what those results revealed. It was a strange kind of camaraderie, bonded by betrayal and a shared determination to find the truth. On the morning the results were due to arrive, I could barely focus on anything else. My heart felt like it was lodged in my throat as I sat down with the envelope in my hands. Whatever was inside would define the rest of my life. It would either confirm my worst fears or grant me a small sliver of relief. I wasn't sure which outcome would be easier to accept. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope, bracing myself for what lay ahead. I sat alone in my office, the test results in my hands, the paper trembling slightly as I unfolded it. My heart pounded with an anxious rhythm, a blend of fear and desperate hope that somehow everything would be all right. But as my eyes scanned the page, my worst fears were confirmed. One of my children was not biologically mine. It felt like a punch to the gut, a betrayal so profound it left me numb. I sat there, staring at the paper, the words blurring as I struggled to process what I was reading. Not long after, Tom called. His voice was tight, his words halting as he told me he'd received his results, too. He was in the same situation, one of his children wasn't his. There was a long silence as we both grappled with the reality that our lives had been upended in ways we'd never imagined. The anger, the hurt, the sense of betrayal, it was overwhelming, but through it all, a steely resolve formed within us both. "David, I don't know how I'm going to face Diane," Tom said quietly, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and pain. "But we can't keep going on like this. We need to confront them, get the truth, every last bit of it." I agreed, feeling my own anger sharpen. "We'll face them together, Tom. No more secrets, no more lies. They owe us the truth." We set a time for Laura and Diane to come over the following evening, intending to confront them in one decisive, final conversation. There would be no hiding behind excuses or evasive words this time. The evidence was irrefutable, and we deserved answers. I spent the rest of the day preparing, steadying myself for the conversation I knew would forever alter the course of our lives. That night, as I sat at the dinner table with my children, I felt a new determination take root. The love I had for them remained unchanged, even if the blood that ran through their veins wasn't entirely mine. They were still my children, and nothing could change that. But I would no longer be the passive bystander, the unsuspecting husband blindsided by lies. The confrontation awaited, and while I had no idea what Laura and Diane's reactions would be, I knew one thing for sure: this time, they wouldn't walk away without facing the full weight of what they'd done. They had fractured our lives, betrayed our trust, and now they would be forced to face the consequences. The next day couldn't come fast enough. The following evening arrived, and I could feel the tension thick in the air as Laura and Diane walked into the house. They seemed unsuspecting at first, greeting us with smiles and small talk, but the somber expressions on our faces must have tipped them off. Their smiles faded, replaced by a mixture of confusion and, in Laura's case, something that looked like apprehension. "David, what's going on?" Laura asked, her voice wary. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "Sit down, Laura. We need to talk." "You too, Diane," I said, nodding toward Tom, who was seated beside me. He looked just as tense, his jaw set in a hard line. They exchanged a glance, but sat down across from us, their postures defensive, as if they sensed what was coming. I laid out everything I'd uncovered, the emails, the late-night calls, the hidden details that had unraveled the life I thought we had. I didn't hold back, listing each piece of evidence like a prosecutor building his case, and as I spoke, I could see Laura's face go pale. Diane shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting to Tom, who had been silently watching her. "And that's not all," I said, my voice breaking slightly as I pushed forward. "Tom and we had paternity tests done." The words landed like a bomb in the room. Diane gasped, and Laura's face crumpled as she looked away, guilt written across every feature. "What?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Only one of my children is mine, Laura," I said, the pain raw in my voice. "Did you think I'd never find out? That you could keep this hidden forever?" Tears welled up in Laura's eyes as she shook her head, her words stumbling out. "David, I never wanted it to be this way. I didn't plan for it to go this far." Tom's voice was cold and cutting as he turned to Diane. "And you, Diane? Were you just going to let us keep living in ignorance, raising kids we thought were ours, while you carried on with these lies?" Diane's face was flushed, her gaze fixed on the floor. She opened her mouth, searching for words, but none came. She seemed as lost as we were, realizing too late the magnitude of the damage she'd caused. Laura tried to reach out to me, her voice pleading. "David, please. I still love you. I was confused, I made mistakes, but you and the kids mean everything to me." I pulled back, unable to look at her, the anger and betrayal too raw to ignore. "Love? You call this love?" I replied bitterly. "What kind of love builds a family on lies? How could you watch me raise a child, knowing all along that he might not even be mine?" Laura broke down, her sobs filling the room, but I felt no sympathy. The depth of her deception left a hollow ache that no apology could ever fill. Tom and I exchanged a glance, both of us filled with the same realization: whatever bond we once had with Laura and Diane was gone, shattered beyond repair. The confrontation ended with them leaving, their apologies trailing behind them like ashes in the wind. And as the door closed behind them, I felt a weight lift, a painful, brutal release, but freedom nonetheless. In the days following the confrontation, a tense silence settled over the house. Laura had asked to stay, pleading for one last chance to fix what she'd broken. Part of me wanted to throw her out, to let her face the consequences of her choices alone. But for the sake of our children, and because a small part of me still clung to the life we'd built, I agreed to let her stay, on strict conditions. One evening, we sat down to talk, this time with no room for half-truths or hidden agendas. Laura looked worn, her face drawn with guilt, but I wasn't ready to soften. I laid out my terms clearly: if she wanted to remain in the family, she had to be fully transparent, no exceptions. That meant cutting off all contact with Mark, giving up any claim to privacy in her communications, and undergoing therapy to address her actions. I demanded honesty, consistency, and, above all, a willingness to confront the damage she'd caused. Laura listened, nodding as I spoke, her face a mix of remorse and determination. "David, I understand. I'll do whatever it takes. I just want a chance to make this right," she said, her voice trembling. Making it right felt like an impossibility, but I was willing to give her the opportunity, if only for the kids. They'd been through enough turmoil, and the thought of tearing apart their lives further was too painful to bear. But deep down, I knew this would be a long, uphill battle, one that might not end the way either of us hoped. We began counseling, facing weekly sessions where Laura was forced to confront the choices that had led us here. Each session dredged up painful memories and accusations, leaving us both emotionally raw. She apologized repeatedly, trying to explain the emptiness she'd felt, the thrill she had found in her affair, the connection she claimed she'd lost with me. Her words were difficult to hear, each one chipping away at the image I'd held of her for so many years. At home, things were cold and distant. The trust that had once come so easily was gone, replaced by a fragile truce held together only by necessity. I felt like I was living with a stranger, someone who looked and sounded like Laura but was far removed from the woman I'd married. We went through the motions, sharing meals and attending school events for the children, but the warmth and comfort of our marriage was nowhere to be found. The kids sensed the tension too, though we did our best to shield them from the worst of it. But there was no hiding the coldness in our conversations, the careful distance we kept from one another. We were a family in name alone, a fractured version of what we'd once been. With each passing day, I questioned whether this strained reconciliation was worth the effort. Laura was trying, that much was clear, but the damage felt irreparable. As much as I wanted to forgive her, to find a way back to the love we'd once shared, I couldn't shake the memory of her betrayal, the knowledge that she had chosen someone else over me. In the end, I knew that only time would reveal whether we could truly rebuild, or if this fragile truce was destined to crumble. And as I looked into her eyes, I wondered if either of us truly believed in the possibility of a fresh start. Months passed in a tense, hollow version of the life we'd once shared. Laura followed the conditions I'd set, attending counseling and cutting off contact with Mark. She apologized every chance she got, doing her best to prove her commitment to our family. But despite her efforts, something had fundamentally changed within me. The love I'd once felt, the trust, the comfort, had been replaced by a guardedness I couldn't shake. The therapy sessions began to feel more like a performance than genuine healing. Laura was putting in the work, but her actions couldn't erase the reality of what had happened. I realized I was holding on for the kids' sake, hoping that one day I'd be able to forgive her fully. But every time I looked at her, I was reminded of the betrayal, the months of lies, the life she'd lived behind my back. One evening, as I sat in the quiet of our home, I made a decision. I couldn't keep living in this half-life, bound by the past and trapped in a marriage that no longer felt real. I'd fought to hold my family together, but sometimes, letting go was the only path to true healing. I decided it was time to move forward, separately. When I told Laura, she looked at me with tears in her eyes, nodding as if she'd known this was coming all along. "I understand, David," she whispered. "I know I broke something that can't be fixed." We agreed to separate amicably, for the sake of the children. The divorce process was painful but straightforward, and we both prioritized the kids, working to provide them with a sense of stability even as our marriage came to an end. Ethan and Grace were old enough to understand some of what was happening, and we explained it to them gently, reassuring them that we'd always be there, even if things would be different now. In the months that followed, I found a new peace settling into my life. I kept close to my children, rediscovering the joys of fatherhood without the weight of a broken marriage. Slowly, I began to heal, finding new routines and focusing on the things that brought me fulfillment. I realized that, in letting go of the life I'd thought was perfect, I'd given myself a chance to build something real, something based on truth, no matter how hard one. And as I stood with Ethan and Grace on a quiet weekend morning, I felt a sense of gratitude, knowing that through it all, I'd gained a new beginning, a fresh start that was entirely my own. The road ahead was unknown, but for the first time, I looked forward to it, free from the shadows of betrayal and ready to live life on my terms.